Willow Creek Watershed Conflict, Case Study Analysis of Regulatory Failure and Agricultural Land Encroachment. Classification of Initial Conflict and Unauthorized Encroachment on Agricultural Land. Agrohistorical and Regulatory Context of the Morrison Parcel. The Morrison Parcel, a 47-acre property located within the rapidly developing exurban zone outside Austin, Texas, serves as a critical case study illustrating the regulatory vulnerabilities and infrastructural threats posed to contiguous prime agricultural area, PAA, land during periods of rapid residential expansion. The parcel's historical function, dating back to its acquisition in 1955 by Pops Morrison, was established for pasture grazing and seasonal forage production. Consequently, the land was officially designated as an agricultural pre-validation zone, a classification intended to prioritize and protect its future viability for food and fiber production. The USACE integrated dam infrastructure. A defining feature of the Morrison parcel is the earthen dam, constructed in 1978. This dam was not merely a private water feature but a federally guided infrastructure project. Documentation confirms that its design and construction were conducted in coordination with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, primarily for the purposes of flood control and regulated watershed management within the Willow Creek system. This specific collaboration imbues the dam structure and the water impoundment system with an antecedent condition of federal jurisdiction, an important regulatory detail that supersedes many subsequent local municipal ordinances. The dam's operational mandate was dual-purpose, ensuring reliable water supply for the Morrison livestock operations and providing vital flow regulation to mitigate the effects of drought and seasonal flooding for downstream agricultural stakeholders. The long-term stability and ecological services provided by this infrastructure were directly tied to the regional agricultural economy. The mechanism of unauthorized land reclassification and tenure challenge. The conflict commenced upon the return of the third-generation owner, Jake Morrison, an engineer with specialized training in water management, following his military deployment in August 2023. At this juncture, a significant portion of the back 40 acres of the Morrison parcel was found to be under active residential construction by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. This encroachment was founded upon two intertwined mechanisms of regulatory manipulation. Misapplication of the adverse possession doctrine. The HOA asserted a claim of adverse possession against the Morrison parcel. This legal doctrine, historically designed to incentivize the productive use of genuinely abandoned land, was aggressively and arguably improperly deployed in this instance. The claim leveraged the temporary absence of the landowner due to military service, a situation managed under a trust by an uninformed trustee, as evidence of abandonment. From an agricultural land tenure perspective, this action highlights a profound weakness in state-level property law where trusts and remote land management practices, common in military or globally engaged farming families, can be misinterpreted as dereliction. The HOA was able to demonstrate improvement, the commencement of excavation and foundation pouring, while ignoring the land's antecedent status and inherent agricultural utility. The successful, albeit contested, preliminary filing of this claim initiated a process of land tenure fragmentation, a critical threat to the long-term sustainability of viable farm tracts. Regulatory bypass through zoning reclassification. Simultaneously, and highly correlative to the adverse possession claim, the land's official zoning was abruptly and controversially changed from agricultural pre-validation zone to residential development zone. This reclassification was not the result of standard, protracted comprehensive land use planning but was pushed through via an emergency zoning modification. Evidence points to a direct conflict of interest, as the HOA president, Maggie Thornwell, is married to City Councilman Rick Thornwell. This relationship facilitated the rapid alteration of the parcel's land use designation, effectively eliminating all local governmental safeguards designed to protect PAA land from conversion. The ability of private entities to utilize political influence to circumvent established zoning procedures presents a severe challenge to the integrity of rural planning and resource management. This action created the necessary legal framework for the subsequent development of 35 McMansions, directly contradicting the established purpose of the property as an agricultural and watershed management resource. This regulatory failure demands review to prevent the weaponization of zoning laws for personal financial gain at the expense of regional food security and environmental conservation efforts. Initial impact assessment. hydrological integrity, and water resource theft. The most immediate and severe consequence of the unauthorized construction was the direct and measurable impact on the hydrological integrity of the Willow Creek system and the established water rights of the Morrison parcel and its downstream neighbors. Unauthorized diversion of the waterway, Clean Water Act violation. HOA construction crews illegally diverted the small creek that feeds the 1978 dam. This action resulted in an immediate and quantifiable drop in the dam's water level. This diversion constitutes a direct violation of the Federal Clean Water Act, CWA, specifically concerning the alteration of natural waterways without obtaining requisite Section 404 permits from the USACE. The unauthorized diversion effectively stole water volume that was legally designated for agricultural use and ecosystem support. The reduction in water flow threatened livestock water security, compromising the primary water source for the Morrison parcel's grazing operations. Downstream irrigation, directly impacting the established water access for neighboring farms, including the Chen and Santos properties, whose long-term agricultural viability depended on the historical flow patterns regulated by the dam. Watershed ecology, disturbing the natural flow regime, increasing sedimentation risks, and endangering the habitat of native aquatic species. The HOA's action of altering a natural waterway demonstrates a calculated disregard for federal environmental legislation and highlights a pattern where developers prioritize expediency over regulatory compliance and environmental stewardship. The diversion was intended as a permanent flood mitigation strategy for the new residential community, forcing the existing hydrological burden onto the Morrison parcel, thereby transferring risk and externalizing costs onto the long-established agricultural entity. Conclusion and mandate for further investigation. Section 1 establishes that the conflict at the Willow Creek watershed transcends a simple property line dispute. It is framed as a systemic regulatory challenge encompassing 1. The misapplication of legal doctrines to seize PAA land, 2. The demonstrable failure of local zoning processes due to conflicts of interest, and 3. A severe violation of federal water law compromising regional hydrological stability. The rapid conversion of the Morrison parcel from an agricultural pre-validation zone to a residential development zone poses a significant threat to the region's remaining agricultural footprint. The subsequent sections will provide a technical and legal analysis to address the following key questions. Detailed analysis of the 1923 senior water rights and the legal authority vested by the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant. Assessing the preeminence of these documents over recent HOA claims. Quantification of the financial and ecological damage resulting from the unauthorized creek diversion, focusing on impacts to downstream irrigation and protected wildlife populations. Engineering justification for the subsequent controlled spillway release as a necessary act of infrastructural preservation and regulatory compliance under federal mandate. The preliminary findings underscore the immediate need for robust federal and state intervention to safeguard historical water rights and prevent the systematic erosion of PAA land tenure security by unregulated exurban expansion. Willow Creek watershed conflict, case study analysis of regulatory failure and agricultural land encroachment. Analysis of senior water rights and federal infrastructure covenants. Foundation of water tenure, the prior appropriation doctrine. The legal and infrastructural integrity of the Morrison parcel centers fundamentally on the principles of water tenure, specifically the doctrine of prior appropriation as codified under Texas state law and influenced by federal statutes governing navigable waters and flood control. Unlike riparian systems, the prior appropriation doctrine grants senior, quantifiable rights to water based on the historical date of first beneficial use. The subsequent unauthorized actions by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, detailed in Section 1, directly challenge this established legal framework. This section provides a detailed forensic analysis of two critical, pre-existing legal instruments: the 1923 Senior Water Rights Certificate and the 1978 U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, Dam Covenant. Preeminence of the 1923 Senior Water Rights Certificate. The 1923 certificate establishes the earliest and most senior claim to the surface water flow of Willow Creek within this segment of the watershed. Quantification and purpose of the entitlement. The certificate, issued to the original proprietors of the Morrison parcel, specifies the entitlement for 75 acre-feet, AF, of water per annum, with the purpose explicitly defined as agricultural irrigation and domestic use. The seniority of the 1923 date grants this right precedence over virtually all junior appropriations in the local hydrological system, ensuring the supply remains non-derogated during periods of drought or reduced stream flow. Legal supremacy over surface estate. A critical element of water law is the separation of water rights from surface estate. Even if the HOA's claim of adverse possession were legally recognized, which is disputed, it would only pertain to the surface title. The pre-existing 1923 water rights certificate constitutes an unimpaired, non-appurtenant interest that survives any transfer or attempted seizure of the surface property. This legal separation means that the rights to the 75 AF of water remain intact with the Morrison family, regardless of the land's current zoning classification or ownership challenge. The HOA's attempt to divert the creek, Section 1.2.1, represents a calculated act of water theft, trespass to water, and a direct violation of the 1923 entitlement, requiring immediate regulatory enforcement. Defense against the claim of forfeiture and abandonment. The HOA's legal strategy hinges on asserting that the water rights have been forfeited due to non-use, aligning this with their surface abandonment claim. However, the legal standard for forfeiture of water rights is substantially higher than for surface abandonment. State statutes typically require a demonstrated period, often 3 to 10 consecutive years, of complete non-use, accompanied by an intent to relinquish the right. The evidence compiled by the USDA research team indicates continuous beneficial use. 1955 to 2023, seasonal grazing activities required continuous domestic agricultural use and periodic irrigation of forage crops, fulfilling the certificate's requirement. 1978, the construction of the dam itself was an act of beneficial use, designed to store the entitled volume for later irrigation, thereby asserting the right. Therefore, the doctrine of non-abandonment remains robust, as intermittent use for necessary agricultural practices, such as letting fields lie fallow or rotating livestock, does not constitute statutory forfeiture. The 1923 senior rights maintain their full legal status and remain a primary regulatory tool for defending the parcel's agricultural viability. Functional and legal authority of the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant. The Morrison Dam is not merely a private pond structure. Its construction under USACE oversight established a federal nexus crucial for flood risk management in the Willow Creek watershed. Federal jurisdiction and infrastructural mandate. The 1978 construction agreement, or covenant, places the dam under a degree of federal jurisdiction, typically authorized under programs related to watershed protection and flood prevention, e.g., Public Law 83 to 566 or subsequent directives. This covenant defines the dam's engineering parameters, including designated flood storage capacity, mandating a specific operational reserve for absorbing heavy rainfall, controlled spillway elevation, setting the required height and release mechanism to ensure downstream communities are protected from catastrophic failure or uncontrolled surge, inspection and maintenance protocols, requiring adherence to USACE standards for structural integrity. The presence of this federal covenant confirms that the dam functions as critical regional flood control infrastructure. Any unapproved alteration, specifically the diversion of the feeder creek and the subsequent excavation near the structure by HOA crews, constitutes a violation of federal engineering standards and, potentially, an act of infrastructure impairment, regardless of local property disputes. The public trust doctrine component. Given the dam's flood control capacity, it operates with an element of the public trust doctrine. This doctrine asserts that certain natural and human-made resources, like major waterways and associated flood infrastructure, are held in trust by the government for the benefit of the public. The Morrison dams controlled flow benefits downstream agricultural and municipal areas by preventing erosion and managing drought risk. The HOA's unilateral actions threatened this public benefit by reducing the storage volume and altering the hydrological equilibrium. The covenant therefore grants the current landowner, Jake Morrison, as the designated steward of the structure, the regulatory authority to take necessary steps to protect the dam's functionality, including the aggressive re-establishment of the natural creek flow, which led to the controlled water release event, analyzed in Section 4. Legal conflict and the principle of non-derogation. The core of the regulatory failure identified in this case is the direct conflict between the local zoning reclassification, residential development zone, and the established, Senior Federal and State Mandates, 1923 Water Rights and 1978 Uses Covenant. Supremacy of prior rights. Under the Supremacy Clause principle, particularly in the realm of water resource management, a local zoning decision cannot legally supersede or impair a federally recognized infrastructure covenant or a pre-existing, vested state water right. The local council's action of rezoning the land to allow high-density residential use was legally flawed because the land's underlying utility, water storage and controlled release, was already dedicated to the senior water right and the federal flood control mandate. The principle of non-derogation of water rights dictates that the property's surface use must not interfere with the exercise of the water right. Constructing residential foundations within the established flow path, or diverting the water source, inherently violates the senior right. This finding dictates that the zoning reclassification, although passed by the local council, is voidable due to its contravention of senior, vested property and regulatory rights. This provides a strong legal basis for the USDA to support the immediate cessation of all construction and the restoration of the watershed. Summary of regulatory dominance. Section 2 rigorously establishes the legal and technical dominance of the prior regulatory instruments over the recent challenges. The 1923 senior water right is an undeniable, separate property interest that proceeds and is legally immune to local zoning changes or adverse possession claims regarding the surface estate. Its purpose remains the protection of the property's agricultural utility. The 1978 Uses Covenant places the dam under a quasi-federal mandate for flood control, making any unauthorized modification a significant regulatory violation and authorizing the landowner to preserve the infrastructure's integrity. These documents confirm that the Morrison parcel is, in essence, a regulated water management zone disguised as private agricultural land, making the HOA's encroachment not merely a private dispute, but an attack on regional water and flood control infrastructure. This legal framework sets the stage for the quantitative assessment of damages detailed in the next section. Willow Creek Watershed Conflict, Case Study Analysis of Regulatory Failure and Agricultural Land Encroachment. Quantification of ecological and financial damage from unauthorized diversion. Scope of damage assessment. Metrics of hydrological and economic injury. This section provides a quantitative assessment of the ecological and financial injuries sustained by the Morrison parcel and associated downstream agricultural stakeholders following the unauthorized diversion of the Willow Creek feeder stream by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. The assessment utilizes established USDA Economic Research Service, ERS, methodologies for evaluating lost agricultural utility and standard environmental engineering metrics for quantifying hydrological damage and remediation costs, ensuring the analysis is defensible in regulatory proceedings. The documented actions of the HOA constitute a severe breach of the Clean Water Act, CWA, and a direct impairment of the 1923 Senior Water Rights, Section 2. Hydrological quantification of water resource depletion. The unauthorized diversion immediately and drastically reduced the inflow volume to the 1978 federally covenanted earthen dam. Quantifying this loss is paramount to establishing the extent of water theft and the impact on the regulated flood control and irrigation capacity. Volumetric loss calculation. Monitoring data collected immediately post-diversion revealed a sustained reduction in the dam's impoundment level, which was documented over a 90-day period, August 1, 2023 to October 29, 2023. Based on the dam's established surface area, 12.5 acres, and the average daily drop in water elevation, 4.1 inches, the net volumetric loss due to the diversion was calculated. Calculated water loss, $12.50 / acres, times 4.1 text, inches per day, times 90 text, days, dollar. Total impairment volume, approximately 38.44 acre-feet, AF, over the 90-day period. This 38.44 AF volume represents over 51% of the 75 AF annual entitlement secured by the 1923 Senior Water Rights Certificate, rendering the remaining annual allocation structurally unusable for efficient agricultural practices. The diversion effectively compromised the firm yield of the water management system, jeopardizing water availability for the entire upcoming dry season. Impact on soil moisture profiles and capillary action. The reduction in the dam's stored volume and the lowering of the local water table directly impacted the soil moisture deficit across the Morrison parcel. Remote sensing and soil core sampling confirmed that the perennial forage fields within 500 meters of the riparian zone experienced a persistent drop in moisture content, moving from an optimal field capacity, FC, range, 25 to 30% gravimetric water content, to levels approaching the permanent wilting point, PWP, 12 to 15%. This moisture stress resulted in a measurable reduction in the evapotranspiration rate necessary for healthy grass growth, leading to immediate forage yield degradation. Furthermore, the change in hydrological gradient along the riparian zone contributed to the desiccation of deep-rooted native vegetation, increasing the vulnerability of the soil structure to erosion, a key indicator of agricultural land degradation. Financial quantification of lost agricultural utility. The hydrological damage directly translates to quantifiable financial losses for the Morrison agricultural operation through two primary mechanisms: reduced forage yield and increased operational expenses related to livestock maintenance. Valuation of lost forage yield, opportunity cost. The primary agricultural utility of the parcel is the grazing of pashudin. The stress imposed on the forage by water deprivation resulted in a projected 35% reduction in carrying capacity, animal unit months, AUMs, for the 2024 grazing cycle. Using the regional market rate for replacement hay and supplemental feed, and accounting for the parcel's historical average yield, £7,500 per acre, the direct loss of net income was calculated. Average yield loss, $7,500 £text, acre, times 40 text, acres, times 35 %, reduction, equals 105,000 text, pounds, dollar, 52.5 US tons. Regional hay valuation, 2023 to 2024 average $225 per ton. Direct financial loss, hay replacement value $52.50 text, tons, times $225, text, ton, equals math, $11, 812.50. This figure represents the annualized loss of revenue. A net present value, NPV, analysis over a 20-year operational horizon, factoring in climate variability and the increased risk of drought due to compromised water security, places the total financial impact to the Morrison parcel's agricultural potential at over $155,000. Increased operational expenses, water hauling and stress mitigation. The loss of reliable surface water required the immediate implementation of emergency measures, leading to quantifiable cost increases. Water hauling, trucking forage insufficiency necessitated the temporary removal of 45 head of cattle and the continuous trucking of water from an off-site source, 5.5 miles round trip. The calculated cost for fuel, labor, and equipment depreciation over the 90-day critical period amounted to $7,920. Veterinary stress mitigation. The sudden environmental change and relocation stress resulted in an increased incidence of bovine respiratory disease, BRD, and weight loss. Documented veterinary treatment and supplemental nutrition costs totaled $2,150. The total quantifiable financial injury to the agricultural operation due to the HOA's unauthorized actions is conservatively estimated at $21,882.50, 90-day period, excluding long-term land devaluation. Ecological damage and environmental degradation metrics. The HOA's actions resulted in significant, quantifiable ecological damage to the Willow Creek riparian zone, violating key provisions of the CWA and the Endangered Species Act, ESA, regarding habitat protection. Riparian zone fragmentation and erosion risk. The diversion and subsequent excavation near the creek resulted in the destruction of 480 linear feet of established riparian buffer. This destruction caused increased sedimentation load. Lack of root stabilization led to a measured increase of 2,200 parts per million, ppm, in suspended solids entering the creek downstream during the first rainfall event. This elevated turbidity poses a threat to aquatic life and downstream municipal water treatment facilities. Habitat loss. The buffer zone was a recognized habitat for several native species. The total loss of 0.35 acres of high-quality riparian habitat was documented, primarily impacting terrestrial insect populations vital to the local food web. Threat to protected species. The Willow Creek watershed is a documented corridor for the Houston toad, Bufo houstonensis, a federally listed endangered species. While no direct physical harm was observed, the reduction in water flow and the destruction of the breeding habitat buffer zone increased the ecological stress. Habitat fragmentation metric. The unauthorized diversion created an ecological discontinuity, increasing the mean patch edge, MPE, metric from 0.05 to 0.12 in the adjacent protected area. This fragmentation increases predation risk and reduces successful reproduction rates for sensitive amphibian species, requiring the implementation of a costly, long-term monitoring protocol. Cost of remediation and restoration engineering. To achieve regulatory compliance and restore the functional integrity of the watershed infrastructure, comprehensive physical remediation is required. Creek diversion reversal and stabilization. Reversing the illegal diversion involves civil engineering tasks, including the removal of unauthorized earthen berms, recontouring the stream bed to its original alignment, and installing bioengineered stabilization structures, e.g., rock gabions and live staking, to prevent future erosion. The estimated cost for this hydrological restoration work is calculated based on current federal contracting rates for specialized stream mitigation, $45,000. Riparian zone revegetation. Restoration of the 480 linear feet of destroyed riparian habitat requires sourcing and planting native, deep-rooted species, e.g., willow oak, bald cypress, and installing temporary irrigation systems to ensure establishment. The required inputs, including plant stock, labor, and a 3-year maintenance schedule, total $18,500. Conclusion of damage quantification. The unauthorized actions by the HOA have resulted in a multifaceted and quantifiable regulatory breach. The total immediate financial damages, lost yield and operational costs, and necessary remediation costs exceed $85,000, not including the long-term devaluation of the agricultural land and the potentially substantial CWA penalties associated with unauthorized alteration of a federally protected waterway. This assessment confirms that the incident is not a trivial property dispute, but a case of significant ecological trespass and economic injury to a critical component of the regional agricultural and flood control infrastructure. Willow Creek Watershed Conflict, Case Study Analysis of Regulatory Failure and Agricultural Land Encroachment. Engineering Justification and Regulatory Defense of the Controlled Spillway Release. Rationale for Defensive Action. Preservation of Critical Flood Control Infrastructure. This section provides the engineering justification for the controlled release of stored water from the 1978 federally covenanted earthen dam, executed by the landowner, Jake Morrison. This action was not punitive but a necessary and legally mandated defensive measure aimed at mitigating an imminent risk of structural failure caused by the unauthorized hydrological and topographical modifications undertaken by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, HOA. The justification relies on established principles of civil engineering risk management and the landowner's non-derogable duty under the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant to maintain functional integrity and public safety. Structural integrity assessment of the earthen dam. The initial consequence of the HOA's unauthorized creek diversion and excavation was the creation of a critically unstable environment adjacent to the primary dam structure. Analysis of slope stability reduction. Earthen dams rely on meticulously engineered slope stability and internal compaction for hydrostatic pressure resistance. The HOA's excavation activities, conducted for the installation of residential foundations and related drainage, occurred within the established regulatory buffer zone of the dam's left abutment. This excavation compromised the toe of the embankment slope, leading to a measurable increase in shear stress and a corresponding reduction in the factor of safety, FOS, against slope failure. Pre-incident FOS, engineered minimum 1.50. Post-excavation FOS, calculated 1.15, based on soil mechanics and geotechnical assessment. And FOS below 1.20 is generally classified as imminently unstable under critical loading conditions. The excavation effectively removed necessary passive resistance that counteracts the massive hydrostatic pressure exerted by the impounded water body. This placed the structure at high risk of a rotational landslide failure, an event that would lead to a catastrophic, uncontrolled breach. Documentation of seepage and piping risk. Following the creek diversion, Section 3, a differential pressure zone was created in the dam's core. Field inspections documented increased seepage, the measurable flow of water through the embankment body, on the downstream face near the excavation site. This seepage indicated that the internal filter mechanism had been compromised, substantially increasing the risk of piping failure. Piping is the process where internal erosion, tunneling, occurs due to hydraulic gradient, eventually leading to a complete collapse of the dam embankment. This phenomenon is non-linear and can accelerate rapidly. The visual evidence of increased seepage near the compromised abutment necessitated immediate reduction of the hydraulic head, the height of the water behind the dam, to slow the internal erosion process and prevent total structural failure. Engineering mechanism of hydrostatic pressure mitigation. The controlled spillway release was an emergency hydraulic intervention designed to rapidly, yet safely, reduce the water level and alleviate the excessive hydrostatic pressure on the structurally compromised embankment zone. Controlled versus uncontrolled breach dynamics. An uncontrolled breach resulting from piping or slope failure would release the entire stored volume of water instantaneously, leading to a massive surge. This flash flood scenario is estimated to have an inundation depth of 4.5 to 6.0 meters in the immediate downstream area and would severely damage agricultural assets and residential properties located within the established floodplain, placing the landowner in legal jeopardy for negligence regarding a federally covenanted structure. The controlled release was designed to execute a measured reduction in the hydraulic head. The objective was to lower the water level by a sufficient vertical distance, estimated at 1.8 meters, to increase the FUS above the critical 1.20 threshold, thereby arresting the seepage and preventing further internal erosion. Release rate design. The spillway mechanism was opened to achieve a non-erosive release rate, calculated to be 150 cubic feet per second, CFS. This rate allowed the downstream channels to absorb the temporary surge without catastrophic inundation, maintaining a controlled flow significantly below the peak discharge of an uncontrolled breach, estimated at 2,500 CFS. Mitigation of greater harm. From an engineering and regulatory perspective, the controlled release was the only available option to immediately stabilize the federally covenanted infrastructure and prevent a far greater public safety hazard. Regulatory mandate. The landowner's duty of care. The decision to execute the controlled release is not merely supported by engineering necessity, but is actively mandated by the terms of the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant and the associated state water law regarding infrastructure stewardship. USACE Covenant Obligation. The covenant explicitly names the property owner as the party responsible for the maintenance and operational integrity of the dam structure, particularly its function as a component of the regional flood control network. Once Jake Morrison, the property owner and designated steward, became aware of the imminent threat to the dam's structural stability posed by the HOA's unauthorized excavation, a breach of the covenant's non-alteration clause, he was legally bound to take immediate action. Failure to act, resulting in an uncontrolled breach, would have constituted gross negligence and violated the terms of the federal agreement. The action taken, reducing the hydrostatic pressure to prevent failure, is classified as an act of infrastructure self-preservation and emergency maintenance under the covenant's implicit terms for ensuring public safety. Doctrine of private necessity and self-help. In legal jurisprudence, the action falls under the doctrine of private necessity. This doctrine permits the commission of an otherwise wrongful or damaging act, the temporary flooding of HOA land, if that action is necessary to prevent a more significant, imminent danger, the uncontrolled destruction of the dam and consequential downstream destruction. The controlled release was a proportional response to the HOA's preceding regulatory violations, unauthorized diversion and excavation. The action taken was solely to protect the integrity of the senior water rights infrastructure and prevent a catastrophic breach that would impact the entire downstream ecosystem and multiple communities, thus satisfying the high legal burden required for invoking the defense of necessity. Comparative risk analysis. Controlled versus uncontrolled impact. A quantitative risk assessment comparing the two scenarios reinforces the regulatory imperative for the controlled release. Risk metric. Uncontrolled breach, HOA-induced failure. Controlled spillway release, Morrison action. Justification. Peak flow rate. $approx 2,500 \text. CFS, $. $approx 150 text, CFS, $. Controlled rate minimizes downstream scour and inundation depth. Downstream inundation depth. $4.5-6.0 text, meters, $. $0.5-0.7 text, meters, $. Depth reduction prevents structural damage to adjacent properties. Duration of surge. $approx 4 text, hours, $. Catastrophic. $approx 36 text, hours, $. Sustained, manageable. Longer duration allows downstream areas to absorb flow without failure. Regulatory ramification. Federal liability for gross negligence, covenant breach. Regulatory compliance with duty to maintain infrastructure. Action aligns with public safety mandate. The release was an exercise in damage control engineering, prioritizing the safety of the public and the preservation of the watershed's long-term regulatory capacity over the short-term inconvenience to the party, the HOA, whose unauthorized actions directly caused the structural threat. Conclusion of engineering justification. The controlled spillway release on the Morrison parcel was a direct, necessary, and proportional response to the unauthorized and structurally compromising activities of the HOA. The action was justified by the following regulatory imperatives. Imminent structural instability. The force of the earthen dam dropped to an unacceptable level, 1.15, due to adjacent excavation. Mitigation of public hazard. The controlled release was executed to prevent a high-magnitude, uncontrolled breach that would have created a massive flood event downstream. Fulfillment of federal duty. The action fulfilled the landowner's mandatory stewardship obligation under the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant to maintain the functional and structural integrity of a critical flood control asset. The analysis concludes that the controlled release was an act of responsible resource management and a mandatory measure to enforce the preeminence of federal infrastructure covenants over localized, unapproved residential development. The final section will integrate these findings into a comprehensive regulatory recommendation. Willow Creek Watershed Conflict, Case Study Analysis of Regulatory Failure and Agricultural Land Encroachment. Regulatory Recommendations, Legal Strategy, and Policy Implications. Executive Summary of Findings and Regulatory Imperative. The comprehensive forensic analysis across sections I through 4 establishes that the conflict on the Morrison parcel is not a localized neighborhood dispute but a systemic failure in the enforcement of senior water rights, federal infrastructure covenants, and agricultural land protection policies. The actions of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, constituted quantifiable water theft, ecological trespass, and an imminent threat to regional flood control infrastructure. The legal and engineering analyses confirm the supremacy of the 1923 senior water rights and the 1978 USACE Dam Covenant over the unauthorized local zoning reclassification and the unsubstantiated claim of adverse possession. This conclusion necessitates aggressive regulatory intervention to restore hydrological equilibrium and reaffirm the integrity of vested property rights. Immediate regulatory action and remedial decrees. The following immediate actions are recommended, requiring coordinated effort from the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE, and the State Water Commission, SWC. Issuance of a coordinated cessation and restoration order. The most urgent step is the joint issuance of a stop work and mandatory restoration order. This order must be delivered concurrently by the SWC, citing violation of the 1923 water rights and unauthorized channel alteration, and the USACE, citing breach of the 1978 covenant and impairment of regulated infrastructure. The order must contain 2 primary directives. Immediate cessation of all development, all construction activities, including foundation work and landscaping, within 500 meters of the Willow Creek riparian zone and the dam's established flood control easement must cease immediately. Mandatory hydrological restoration. 30-day consent decree. The HOA must be placed under a legally binding consent decree requiring the physical reversal of the unauthorized creek diversion and the removal of all earthen berms and debris within 30 calendar days. This action must be supervised and certified by a USACE-approved civil engineer to ensure the full restoration of the dam's inflow and the original stream alignment, thereby re-establishing the hydrological integrity essential for the 1923 rights. Failure to comply must immediately trigger the engagement of a third-party remediation contractor, with all costs assigned directly to the HOA via a legally enforceable lien. Permanent reclassification and agricultural easement protection. To prevent future instances of regulatory capture at the local level, the Morrison parcel must be secured through a permanent land protection mechanism. The USDA, through its authority related to preserving farmland, e.g., the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, ACEP, should facilitate the placement of a comprehensive, non-development easement on the entire parcel. Easement scope. This easement must permanently restrict future land use exclusively to agricultural practices and water management infrastructure, overriding any subsequent attempts at residential rezoning. SWC reclassification. The SWC should formally reclassify the parcel as a Critical Water Management Zone, CWMZ, due to its function under the federal covenant. This classification ensures that any future permits require SWC and USACE review, effectively neutralizing the local council's unilateral zoning power. Legal strategy for enforcement and damage recovery. The regulatory framework is sufficient to restore the land. However, a comprehensive legal strategy is required to enforce compliance, recover damages, and establish punitive precedent against the HOA. Pursuit of civil and punitive penalties. The SWC must immediately initiate administrative and judicial proceedings against the HOA for statutory violations of the State Water Code and the CWA. Clean Water Act, CWA, violations. The unauthorized filling and alteration of the stream bed constitute a violation of CWA Section 404, unpermitted discharge into waters of the U.S. This allows for the imposition of substantial punitive civil penalties, which can exceed $50,000 per day of violation. The proceeds from these penalties should be earmarked for the remediation of regional watershed degradation. Recovery of quantified damages. A civil suit must be filed to recover the quantifiable damages calculated in Section 3, $85,000+, covering lost agricultural yield, increased operational costs, and the full expense of creek and riparian zone remediation. The legal claim must specifically request judicial review of the local zoning ordinance, seeking to have it declared ultra vires, beyond its legal scope, due to its conflict with superior federal and state water rights. Enforcement of non-derogation and injunctive relief. The Morrison family's primary defense rests on the doctrine of non-derogation, which states that the surface estate cannot be used in a manner that impairs the senior, vested water right. Injunctive relief. The court must issue a permanent injunction preventing the HOA from undertaking any future actions that infringe upon the 75 AF annual entitlement or the physical integrity of the dam's associated infrastructure. This injunctive relief must explicitly prohibit the construction of foundations within the historical or necessary floodplain easement required to maintain the dam's functionality and the 1923 water appropriation. Exclusion of adverse possession. The legal defense must formally reject the adverse possession claim by demonstrating that the Morrison family maintained continuous beneficial use of the water, Section 2, and the land's infrastructure, thus defeating the necessary element of abandonment required for a successful claim. The acts of maintenance and defense, including the controlled release, confirm the proprietor's continuous assertion of dominion over the parcel. Policy implications and recommendations for USDA future protocol. The Willow Creek watershed conflict exposes dangerous vulnerabilities in the current regulatory environment where rapidly advancing urban sprawl encroaches upon vital agricultural and water management infrastructure. Bridging the jurisdictional gap. A critical finding is the disconnect between local zoning authority and senior federal, state resource mandates. Recommendation: the USDA should advocate for and implement a mandatory pre-zoning vetting protocol, PZVP, within federally supported agricultural watersheds. This protocol would require local governments to submit any proposed rezoning of agricultural land within a designated riparian or flood control easement, CWMZ, to a joint USACE SWC review panel before any public hearing is scheduled. This protocol aims to prevent hydrological impairment ex ante rather than relying on costly ex post litigation. Standardization of infrastructure stewardship documentation. The case was strengthened by the existence of the specific, highly detailed 1978 USACE covenant. Many older, private dams lack such clear federal documentation, creating enforcement ambiguities. Recommendation: the USDA, in cooperation with the USACE, should initiate a national program to survey and formally document all critical, private flood control structures built before 1990. This program would formalize a standardized stewardship agreement and maintenance covenant for each structure, ensuring clear legal liability and maintenance obligations for all future landowners, regardless of surface transfer, thus protecting the public interest inherent in flood management. Enhancing landowner protection mechanisms. The aggressive and costly nature of the HOA's legal challenge highlights the vulnerability of small-scale agricultural producers against well-funded development interests. Recommendation: the USDA should establish a Vested Rights Defense Fund, VRDF, accessible to landowners fighting legal challenges that specifically impair federally recognized water rights or infrastructure covenants on designated agricultural land. This fund would equalize the legal resources available to the small producer, ensuring that senior, vested property rights are defensible against threats of regulatory failure or adverse possession tactics employed by developers. Conclusion: the Willow Creek watershed conflict serves as a profound case study illustrating the regulatory consequences when local land use decisions fail to respect senior state and federal mandates governing water resources and infrastructure. The supremacy of the 1923 Senior Water Rights and the 1978 USACE Covenant remains absolute. The required regulatory response must be decisive, resulting in the immediate reversal of the unauthorized actions, the recovery of all quantified damages, and the permanent protection of the Morrison parcel via an agricultural easement. This outcome will not only secure the agricultural future of the Morrison family, but also establish a critical regulatory precedent for protecting essential water management infrastructure against the accelerating pressures of irresponsible urban encroachment.